So, hello everyone out there. Good morning to our friends in the US. Thanks for joining our webinar today. Today we'll talk about multi-tenancy for software as a service products. My name is Benjamin Hoffman. I am a technical consultant here with Camunda, and with me is Philip Osler, and he's one of the core developers who actually implemented the multi-tenancy features. And Philip will be here with us in the chat, and he will be happy to answer your questions.
Hello, everyone.
So, as you might know, multi-tenancy regards the case in which a single Camunda installation should serve more than one tenant. And for each tenant, certain guarantees of isolation should be made in terms of the data security. For example, one tenant's process instance should not interfere with those of another tenant, and they shouldn't see the data of each other's tenant. And that's basically what we'll look into today. And here's our agenda. So first of all, we'll discuss the core idea of multi-tenancy and how it's implemented in Camunda. And afterwards, we'll look at some single features and how to use them. And this will also include some live demos. Finally, we'll probably have a 15 minutes Q&A session, and we will pick up some of your questions from the chat, which we haven't answered before, and that might be interesting for all attendees. So how does multi-tenancy in Camunda BPM work? Basically, there are two approaches of achieving multi-tenancy. The first approach is to have one process engine per tenant. The other way is to use just one process engine, which is shared by all tenants, and associate the data with tenant identifiers. And the two ways differ from each other in the level of data isolation and also the effort of maintenance and scalability. So here's the first one. This is the concept of one process engine per tenant. And that's what used to be there like for the last, couple of releases of Camunda BPM. So you can actually set up just one process engine per tenant and have separate databases, schemas, or tables, depending on how you set it up. The process engines can run on the same server, so they can all share the same computational resources, such as the data source if you use isolating via schemas or tables. And they can also share a common thread pool for asynchronous job execution. This approach of achieving multi-tenancy guarantees the highest level of data isolation because you can have separate databases. However, there might be a high maintenance effort if you have numerous tenants, like if you have hundreds or thousands of tenants, you will have to maintain a single process engine and maybe also a separate database per tenant. And there's no central feature in the cockpit application, for instance, to watch all the tenants' data in one shared view. And that is the reason why we have implemented the second approach of achieving multi-tenancy. And here, all data of all tenants is stored in the same table. And the isolation is provided by the means of a tenant identifier, which is stored in a separate column. And all queries to the engine will be filtered by the tenant. For instance, if you want to create a process instance, you normally use a user which belongs to a tenant, and then based on the tenant ID of the user, you will query the engine to start a new process instance, and use the user's tenant ID for the process. We will see that in a minute. But that's basically how the one shared process engine approach works. And this second approach is pretty new with the Camunda 7.5 release. Because you could have done it before, like with your own implementation, but with the new 7.5 release of Camunda BPM, we added this tenant ID column in all relevant database tables. And now you can conveniently query the engine with the Java API or the REST API using those tenant ID filters. And also you can use the cockpit application and tasklet applications for multiple tenants without really caring about the whole tenancy concept when using it. So let's have a couple of examples. The first one we want to look at is how to create a new tenant. In order to do that, you can either use the admin web application, which ships with Camunda, or of course you can use the REST API or the Java API. And imagine you're a software as a service provider. You might want to have your own registration process. So you might want to have a custom front end where users can register and then a new tenant gets created automatically. And we also will look at this. So the first way of creating a new tenant is the Camunda web application, as I said, and we will have a look at this in a demo which follows. And basically you just go to admin, and this has been improved in 7.5 as well. And then you go to tenants, create a new tenant, and then provide a tenant ID and tenant name. That's it. Second way of creating a new tenant could be via the REST API or the Java API. And in those pictures, you can see links to the docs. Like if you go to Camunda docs, manual reference and REST API, you will find a section about tenants, and then you will find the correct command to create a new tenant. And for the Java API, you use the identity service to create a new tenant. As I said, you can also have like your own custom setup, own registration process. And this one is just an example process of how that could look. So imagine a new tenant needs to be set up, or the existing tenant setup needs to be changed. First thing you could do is to check if the tenant already exists. And if it doesn't exist, you create a new tenant using the Java API. And then the registration form could also include like registration parts for different users. And these could be cockpit users like process operators, or taskless users, which can be used for the process participants who only use taskless. And depending on how many users of each kind you have set up in the registration form, you create those users and set the correct authorization for each user. And then you are basically set up, you have a tenant and you have users that belong to the tenant. And afterwards, you could just simply do all the other management tasks you need to do in order to fulfill your registration. For instance, you could do billing, you could send out confirmation emails, you could do whatever maintenance you need to do for your business. So let's have a look how it will look in practice. The live demos will be based on like 3 different views. The one you see here also always shows the view of a global admin. So this would be your software as a service provider admin This one's called Demo, and he is part of the Camunda admin group. And the Camunda admin group, this one, allows to see all tenants' data. So whoever is part of the group Camunda admin can see the data of all tenants. So this would be a global administrator. And there will be 2 other views during the live demos, each for 1 tenant. So there's one user, Mr. X, who belongs to 1 tenant, and there will be another user, Mr. Y, who belongs to another tenant. So we can see actually which data is shown for which tenant. But before we look into the different tenants, I will quickly show you how to set up a new tenant. So what I did is you can see it here, but you can probably see it in Cockpit. I set up a process called create a specific tenant-specific user, and that's exactly the one I showed you on the slide. It checks if the tenant already exists, and it creates users based on their role, Cockpit or task list, and then this is like a placeholder for all other tasks. And this process is actually called by a custom UI, and to do this, I just created a sample web page, which is for demonstration purposes only, where you can sign up as a user. And that's what we are going to do now. Let's just assume someone of a company called Monsters.inc wants to register himself for the BPM cloud service. And his first name might be Cookie, and his last name might be Monster. His email address is cookie.monsters@monsters.inc. And of course his username is Cookie, because that's his nickname, and the password is hidden, secret password. So as soon as he submits, a process was triggered, and we can't see this in runtime because it happened so fast, but if we go to history, we see that a new process instance had just been started and a second afterwards ended. And here we can see all steps have been fulfilled, and because the new user is always a Cockpit user who is administrator of the new tenant, a new user has been created here. You can also see that in tenants, there is a new tenant called Monsters Inc. And there is a new user called Cookie Monsters for the tenant. If you didn't want to use a custom frontend or the Java or REST APIs, you could also create a new tenant in Camunda admin. And let's just assume this tenant is my company, and the tenant name, the tenant name is my company. You could just manually create a new tenant within the admin web application. But I think the normal way for you software as a service providers would be a custom registration form. And then let's just imagine the new Cookie Monster user signed in, and then you could also like manage users to for his account. So this will just replace the signing in procedure. And if we wanted to say for monsters.inc, we want to create a new task list user. That one could be Godzilla, and the email address is Godzilla@monsters.inc. monster.inc. The username is Godzilla. And then we just add a new user, and that's how you could implement a custom user management for your software as a service product. And of course, we can see that the Godzilla user was created as well. So that's basically how you can create a tenant with your own custom front end, and how you could use a Camunda process to manage tenants and users for your system. Next thing I'd like to show you is how we can use shared process definitions. So imagine you have hundreds of tenants, but you have like processes which can be used by all tenants. So what you want to do is you only want to deploy the process definition once, and then each time a tenant-specific user starts a process instance, this process instance should be assigned to the tenant. And in order to do this, you have to implement the SPI called tenant ID provider, and you can either implement that as a process engine plugin, or you could also implement it as a process engine configuration as part of your process engine configuration. And after you've done that, you can deploy a process definition without a tenant ID, and then start a process instance as a user that is a member of a specific tenant, and then the process instance will be assigned to the tenant ID. This is how you can find the tenant ID provider, so it's part of the Camunda API, and I will show you how it works in a minute. So this needs to be implemented in order to tell the engine which tenant has started a process instance, or as well as a case instance for a decision instance. So actually, I just changed the configuration of this Camunda engine. You can't really see that, but trust me, I did. I implemented this SPI, and I also deployed a process definition, which is the sample invoice receipt process you might know from the prepackaged distributions. And this is the invoice receipt process, and you can see that it was deployed without any tenant ID. But because we implemented this tenant ID provider, we can use a tenant-specific user like Mr. Y, and he also sees that invoice receipt process in Cockpit. And if he wants to start a new process instance of invoice receipt, let's just quickly do some stuff here. Creator would be great. Pizza. Amount, some sample invoice number. Let's just start this process instance. If you go to all tasks, you can see that there is a task approved invoice, which was created a few seconds ago. So this is our process. And now let's just change to the other tenant, Mr. X. And you can already see in Cockpit that the process instance we just started is not visible for that tenant. And it's also, the task is not there. There's only one old task which was created 6 hours ago, but we can't see the one which was created a few seconds ago. And let's just start one here as well. Let's just say Monsters Inc. is credited, and the amount might be really high. and the invoice number is something like this. So I created 2 process instances for 2 different tenants, and we can see that each tenant can only see his process instances, but he can't see the other ones. But we can see that the Camunda administrator, he can actually see all of the process instances that have been created. And if he wants to look into one of them, he can also see that the tenant ID for this specific instance has been set. So this is acme.inc, which is the tenant of Mr. X. And we go back, also see the awesome Saas Limited, and that's the tenant of Mr. Y. So that's how you can use shared process definitions. You deploy them once for all tenants, or you can use authorizations to limit the access for different users or tenants. So you deploy these process definitions once, and each tenant can have his own instances of this shared process definition. Another use case could be to deploy a tenant-specific process definition. So if you have processes which should be available only to a single tenant, you can specify this in the process XML deployment descriptor. And as you can see there in line 6, if you provide a tenant ID for your process archive, this will be instantly assigned to that tenant. So tenant ABC will have access to this particular process instance here. I also did that for a process here, which is called tenant-specific process. And you can see here already this was deployed for the awesome Saas Limited tenant. And if I click on it, we can also see that the tenant ID is provided here. So let's just check in Cockpit if this tenant can access the process definition, and he can because he's a member of that. This user is a member of the tenant, so he sees the tenant-specific process. But the other one, Mr. X, who belongs to the other tenant, he doesn't have access to the tenant-specific process. So that's that's basically how you can deploy process definitions for single tenants, and also you can deploy decision definitions for a specific tenant, just like this. And of course, Mr. Y, if he got the authorizations to start a process, he can also start a tenant-specific process, and this will be visible for the user. One process instance just has ended, and it will also be visible for the Camunda admin user. Just quickly look here. So what's important, the demo user, he's not part of any tenants. So he doesn't belong to any tenant. He is tenant independent, but because he's member of the Camunda admin group, he can see the data of all tenants. And he can see the completed process instance here. And that was the one I just started. One last feature I want to show you is how to use tenant-specific call activities. So imagine you have a global process which has been deployed for all tenants. So it has been deployed without any tenant ID, and it will be a shared resource to all tenants. But in order to have like different sub-processes or different parts for each tenant, like tenant-specific configurations or setups, you can use call activities and map them to the different tenants. And this can be used for call activities like BPM and CMN. It also can be used for business rule tasks. Let's say if you wanted to provide different decision tables and different rule sets for different tenants. And that's how you do it. You model a process with a call activity, and then say the called element is some sub-process. And then for the tenant ID, you provide a bean which resolves the tenant ID of the calling process. So this is just a Java class called element tenant ID provider, and it will resolve the tenant ID based on the execution. Let's also have a look into this. So this is my global process, which is deployed without any tenant ID. We can see that the called activity, the called element is the tenant-specific sub-process, and the tenant ID will be provided by the called tenant ID provider. And then we have different sub-processes here. The first one will be for the tenant ACME. The ID is of course tenant-specific sub-process because that's the same ID which is called here. And this is just a random sub-process for a single tenant. And another tenant, the awesome Saas tenant, he should have a different sub-process, and that is what we see here. And one thing that is really important is that you have to provide actually the same ID. So you have to, for all specific sub-processes, you have to provide the same process ID here. You can have different names, but you have to provide the same ID because that is what is referenced in the call activity here. So this ID has to be used in all sub-processes. Let's just quickly have a look in Eclipse, how the deployment descriptor looks for this particular case. So we have a process called tenant-specific call activity, which is deployed without any tenant ID, and then we have two sub-processes here. One for the tenant Acme Inc. and the other one for Awesome Saas. And then this whole project will be deployed to the server. And that's what we can see in the process definition of the Camunda admin demo. So there's one process with tenant-specific call activity and two different tenant-specific sub-processes here. And one has the tenant ID Acme Inc. and the other one has Awesome Saas. As we can see here, this is the call activity, the process with the call activity I just showed you. And this is the sub-process number one. It will actually just write something to the console, provide a user task, and print out the output of the user task. And I will show you that in a minute. And the other one is much more simple. It will just log something to the console. So let's just have a look how it looks like for tenant number one. So if we wanted to start a process, we can also see that the tenant has access to the process with tenant-specific call activity, but only has access to one of the two tenant-specific subprocesses. So let's just start a tenant-specific call activity for this tenant, and let's have a look what happened here. Go to the history. We can see that one has just been started and ended because it was so quick, and this one has called the tenant-specific subprocess 2. So that's the one which was deployed for Mr. Y. If we change to Mr. X, so the user of the other tenant, we can see that he has access to the process with a tenant-specific call activity and also to the tenant-specific subprocess number 1. And then we start the process for this tenant. First, we can see that there is a user task for the tenant-specific subprocess number 1. And we can also see that there is a running instance for this process with tenant-specific call activity. We can see the tenant ID has been provided by the global tenant ID provider, and also a call process instance is the one number 1. So that's the one of Mr. X. So let's just quickly claim the task and write something so you can see the process will actually be finished as well. Yeah, just let's write something random. Aliens have landed, or whatever. And let's have a look into the cockpit here, and the process should be finished by now. So we see process instance has been finished, and that was the one we just finished. And if we want to have a look at the console, you can see here that the first subprocess actually wrote this is a subprocess for Awesome SaaS Limited, and the second subprocess wrote this is a subprocess for admin.inc and aliens have landed, as I just typed into the user task. So that's basically what I wanted to show you about multi-tenancy with tenant identifiers. You can find out more if you go to the Camunda docs, and be sure you access the docs from the latest version, because that's the one where multi-tenancy has been massively improved. And then go to user guide, process engine, multi-tenancy. You can find some examples on the GitHub Camunda BPM examples repo, and that's a repository which is maintained by the product team. So basically, most of the stuff which is there for multi-tenancy has been provided by Philip. And you can also have a look at the Camunda consulting repository, which has been maintained by the consulting team. And there will be a section shortly on the snippets, multi-tenancy with tenant identifiers. I think I'll upload this week, and then you can find the examples I showed you in the webinar, and you can also find the custom from for user registration. Well, I guess we could look into some questions now. If you have any and haven't typed them in yet, please feel free to do that. Let's just have a look at the chat, and Philip has been also answering some questions from the chat already, but let's just see if there are any more questions we haven't answered yet. And there's one question saying, if we are not using Cockpit or Tasklist, so the provided Camunda web applications, what purpose does creating a tenant serve? And maybe Philip wants to answer that, because he's the one in charge of the chat.
Okay. If you don't use the Camunda web apps, you don't need to create the tenants using the identity servers or the admin. But you can if you want to model the relationships between the tenants and the users and groups. So if you want to use the tenant transparent access restrictions, you can use these relationships to query the tenants of the users or the groups and set this at the authenticated tenants. So it's one way to make it easy to model the relationship and get it, but it's not necessary.
Okay, thank you, Tenant. Sorry, thank you, Philip. I have said the word tenant too much in this webinar. There is another question saying, why is this better than the older version of multi-tenancy, and can I still use the old version? I guess by saying old version, you refer to the approach of multiple, like one process engine per tenant. And of course, you can still continue to use that. And well, there are some scenarios. Let's assume you have like thousands of tenants and all of them only have little data to manage. Then it might be a heavy load on like a high maintenance effort, which you don't want to have for like thousands of tenants. You don't want to maintain thousands of engines. However, if you want to make sure that the data is completely isolated and that all the tenants don't interfere with each other in terms of computational resources. So if you want to make sure that each engine serves a specific tenant, and then you can also scale the engines differently, you might want to use the old concept of having one engine per tenant. So of course you can use both approaches, and the old version of multi-tenancy won't disappear. That's just something like the new concept we implemented is just might be easier to handle for other scenarios and use cases. There is another question saying tasks can only be filtered by tenant when the user creating a process is a member of a tenant. Well, if you're using the tenant identifiers concept, you have to provide a tenant ID somewhere in order to filter it. So if you're not providing any tenant IDs, you can't filter the tasks by tenant. And Philip wants to add something to that.
Yeah. If you want to filter by tenants, you don't need to create the tenants using identity servers. You just can filter by tenants, but the tenant IDs, but the tenants don't have to exist as entities. So you don't need to create an admin or your identity servers.
Yeah, thanks, Philip, for clarifying that. There is one more question saying, is there a scaling concept for the Camunda engine? This doesn't really relate to multi-tenancy, but I can assure you there is. You can easily use Camunda with clustered setups, and you will be able to find more information about that on our website, camunda.com, and then have features and scalability, and then you'll find out why Camunda scales like hell. Also, there are information in the docs available on how to set up clusters with Camunda. So yes, there are scaling concepts for sure. Okay. if there are no other questions, then thanks for watching the webinar. Oh, there's one more. Can you mine the data from all tenants' data for reports? You want to set a link to that? Yep.
So currently, if you want to create custom reports, you can make it easy because all the data is in one table. So you can create a report by yourself, and which includes the data from all tenants. The report we provide using the cockpit. So the duration report currently does not support the difference between the tenants.
Thanks. Someone's asking if it's possible to download this webinar to distribute it to colleagues. There is a recording and it will be online shortly. You'll be able to access it with the link you got for attending the webinar. I'm not quite sure if you can download it, but it will be available for like video streaming on Vimeo as well. So your colleagues will have access for sure. Okay, so there seems to be no more questions. So thanks for watching the webinar. Philip and myself are saying goodbye. If you need any more information, you can go to camunda.com for any commercial matters you might come up with. And you can also go to camunda.org for the community-oriented side of the product. You can use the forums and read the docs if you're interested in the features. Of course, you can also contact us directly with the support if you're an enterprise customer, or just use the normal contacts if you want to know more. So thanks again, and goodbye. Have a nice day.